Mine as is? Or should I pull it? Okay. Om Namah Shri Atirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swami Tapaharini. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We started discussing the Ashtanga Yoga, the eight-limbed yoga, last time. And we stopped in the middle of 2.30. So the 8 limbs of yoga, Yama, Niyama, and so on, we focused on the first 2 of the 5 Yamas. Yamas, in one word, are the don'ts, the 5 big don'ts, D-O-N-T-S. Do not do these things. Refrain from doing these things. Okay. And then the Niyamas are the do's, things that you should do as spiritual aspirants, that we should do. Okay. So we got through the first 2 of the 5 Yamas, the don'ts. And what were they? Ahimsa, non-injury, non-violence, and we talked about its various meanings, ramifications, and so on. It doesn't just mean don't hit another person. It's much more subtle than that. And then satya, truthfulness, observing truthfulness is also a fundamental yama. And that also turns out to be quite complex sometimes. And we talked about that last time as well. If you missed that class, please look at the last class, Yoga Sutra class 27. So we're going to continue where we left off. We're going to talk about the remaining 3 yamas, and then we are going to move on to Sutras 2.31, and then ideally 2.32, where the 5 niyamas, the 5 do's, are discussed. Okay? So that's the plan. Let's look at page 246 of Edwin Bryant's The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It's his commentary on 2.30. And at the bottom of the page, he explains the 3rd yama, okay, which he translates as refrainment from stealing. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, that's the... Oh, sorry, I reversed these. That's my mistake. So, brahmacharya is 4th. This was... Oh, boy. Okay, hold on. Yeah? I don't think we have an extra one right now. Yeah. Sorry. But I'll read it out and you can kind of... I don't think it should be too hard. Sorry. So this is 3... and this is 4. Sorry for confusing you. Okay. All right. So, don't steal. That is the number 3. Don't steal. And he's explaining it as follows. Refrainment from stealing, the 3rd yama, is described as not taking things belonging to others and not even harboring the desire to do so. This latter aspect is important, explains Vachaspati Mishra, since action is initiated in the mind. The more one desires something, the more inclined one becomes to acquire it. Thoughts of stealing obviously cannot exist in those free of desire, says Shankara. Even if one finds a treasure trove or jewel by chance, it should not be taken since it belongs to someone else, says Hariharananda. Okay, so again, there's always like a grosser and a more subtle understanding of these practices. And so refraining from stealing isn't just don't take things that belong to other people, but the subtler aspect of it is you shouldn't even have a desire to take anything that belongs to another person. And that's much more difficult, seems to me. Okay. And then, at least in the US, I think they have this idea called the finder's, what is it? The finder's fee. So if you're hiking and you find somebody's wallet, right? You're a good Samaritan, so you're going to return the wallet. It's got all sorts of valuable stuff like driver's license and all that stuff. But you take a finder's fee first, $20 or $50, and then you hand it over. And I remember my friend did that once, and I was like, this doesn't doesn't sit right with me, taking a finder's fee. So anyway, I think that's ruled out. The finder's fee is ruled out by this. Asteya is the Sanskrit term, asteya, which means non-stealing. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to just adjust the thermostat here because it's a little stuffy. Okay. Now, Okay, so now we get to a very important don't, which is called brahmacharya. So this is the fourth of the 5 yamas. So we're going to spend a bit of time on this to understand what it really means. Now, Bryant, I think a little bit misleadingly, translates brahmacharya as celibacy. Okay? Now, why do I think that's misleading? Well, because all that celibacy means is you're refraining from sexual activity, right? Swami Vivekananda, in his commentary, he translates brahmacharya differently, not as celibacy, but as continence. Okay, Continence. And I think that's a better translation of brahmacharya because it's deeper and more comprehensive, it seems to me. So continence, what does it mean? In one phrase, continence means purity in thought, word, and deed. Sexual purity in thought, word, and deed. So it's not just refraining from the act, but even your thoughts should be pure. Even what you say should be pure. And even, at the grossest level, you should also refrain from sexual activity at a physical level. And it gets very subtle. This is probably the hardest aspect of spiritual life for almost everybody. So it's worth looking at the commentary here. This is on page 247 of Bryant's commentary. Vyasa defines brahmacharya as the control of the sexual organs. And this is refined by Vachaspati Mishra, so one of these other commentators, as not seeing, speaking with, embracing, or otherwise interacting with members of the opposite sex as objects of desire. So this is the more fundamental understanding of brahmacharya. It's very difficult, especially in this day and age where everything is saturated with the opposite, right? Television has become almost pornographic at this point. That's the way that they get more views, and then there's online and everything. So it's just kind of a perfect storm. And if you just practice celibacy, which is the word that Bryant uses, and then you ignore the other stuff, you're gonna go crazy probably. It doesn't work. And then, so you have to completely transform your lifestyle basically to practice brahmacharya properly, it seems to me. It's a lifestyle change. And then ultimately, you have to transform the way you think about yourself and thinking about other people, basically, right? It's a transformation of your own identity and a transformation in the way that you look at other people. So what does brahmacharya actually mean? Brahmacharya. Brahma means the divine, Brahman. And so etymologically, kind of literally, it means dwelling in Brahman. Almost like living as a god, living in the divine way. And what I like about this term is that it emphasizes the positive, actually. Even though it's a don't, right? Don't do certain things. But it gives you an overarching positive reason for it. The rationale is, look, in our deepest essence, we are divine. We're eternal divine souls. And we only engage in sexual activity because we fail to identify with our divine nature, because we're mistakenly identifying with the body-mind complex instead. So it's basically telling us, most fundamentally, realize what you really are. Realize who you truly are, which is divine. And the divine has no desires, right? And everybody is divine. Okay, so that's kind of the positive side of brahmacharya. And along the lines of that, I really like Kierkegaard. I mentioned him in, I don't think it was this class, but maybe like a gospel class or something. Søren Kierkegaard was a great Danish philosopher and also Christian thinker. And he wrote a number of masterpieces, but one of them is the book is called Purity is to Will One Thing. Or Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing. Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing. It's a whole book. Just a meditation on this statement, this phrase. And it's really worth reading. It's him at his most spiritual and practical. It's a kind of spiritual manual, basically, for the practice of purity. And I wanted to read to you one part of it. He says, he quotes the Apostle James's words in his epistle, chapter 4, verse 8 from the Bible. And this is the quote from the Bible: "Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded." End quote. And then Kierkegaard gives a brief exposition of it. He says, "For only the pure in heart can see God, and therefore draw nigh to him. And only by God's drawing nigh to them can they maintain this purity. And he who in truth wills only one thing can will only the good," with a capital G, and he means God here. "And he who only wills one thing, when he wills the good, can only will the good in truth." Some light just went out there. Okay. This is a beautiful statement, quotation from the Bible. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. What does this remind us of? Does this remind us of any of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings? Anyone? Want to take a stab at it? Yeah? No?
Just put my mind on it. I was thinking, obviously, that give all that you are doing in life to God.
To God. Okay, that's true. There's one that's even more, directly connected to this specific statement. But it's a little obscure because you don't find it in the gospel, and as far as I'm aware, you don't find it in Sharanani's biography. You find it in this little compilation of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings by Swami Brahmananda called Sri Sri Ramakrishna Upadesh. And it's translated into English, to be honest, not very good English, as Words of the Master. And fortunately, Swami Chaitanyaji has recently retranslated it, so that either has come out or is going to come out soon in his thing called 5 Gospels. That's one of the 5 Gospels that he's translating. So anyway, so you can find it there. The teaching is wonderful. If you take one step towards God, God will take 10 steps toward you. Right? Have any of you have heard that teaching? Yeah, one out of, yeah. So that's because it's not, even if you read the entire gospel, you won't find it there as far as I'm aware. But you find it in this other compilation. Okay. So I didn't realize actually that there's a statement in the Bible which basically says almost exactly the same thing. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. And then James says, "Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded." And in another part of the same book, Kierkegaard has this beautiful reflection on what it means to be double-minded. And he says basically, we're all double-minded. That's why we're spiritual aspirants. We haven't attained perfection yet. We haven't attained total purity. And let's go down here. We need more light. Okay, and so being double-minded means you will multiple things. You desire various things in this world, and you also sort of will God sometimes, once in a while, half-heartedly, right? That's kind of how most of us are. But what did Jesus say? You can choose God or mammon, but not both, right? You have to choose one or the other. And most of us are mixed to begin with. We have some faith in God. We have some devotion toward God. But we also, our minds are drawn, we're double-minded. Really, we're triple and quadruple-minded, right? Double is being generous. But our minds are running in many directions. So that's why Kierkegaard said true purity, in its positive sense, is to will one thing and one thing alone. And what is that one thing? God. Right? How many of us can say that we will only God, that we desire only God? I was just thinking when we had Arati today, the evening Arati, the second song composed by Swami Vivekananda in Sanskrit, Om Rim Ritam, right? the meaning of the first of the 4 verses in that is, because I cannot meditate on you and worship you and think about you constantly day and night, therefore, O Lord, I take refuge at your lotus feet. Right? We're admitting our inability to will just God, right? And to think only about God. Naktam divam. Okay? So even just confessing to God our own weakness, our own limitations, our own failures is itself a very powerful spiritual practice, actually. And the Arati song itself expresses that, right? Just by singing it. And that's why understanding the meaning of the words is really helpful, actually. So if we have little booklets explaining the Arati hymns, so even if you don't know Bengali or Sanskrit, you can understand the meaning, and then when you participate in Arati, it becomes much more meaningful. Okay. So I think that's what Kierkegaard has in mind. This whole idea of purity comes from, obviously, the famous statement of Jesus. Jesus is, right? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And so this whole book, Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing, is Kierkegaard's reflection on what it means to be pure, right? So I think it's very powerful, and if you want more details, do look at that book by Kierkegaard. I want to mention a couple other things in the context of brahmacharya. Sri Ramakrishna often in the gospel talks about how we should replace our aihika chakshu. This is a bit of a tongue twister. Okay, chakshu means eyes or vision. And aihika means worldly. Okay, so most of us, we view the world and we view others with worldly eyes, which means what? We see other people as bodies, we desire them, or we feel aversion toward them, and so on. And we often treat people and other things as means to an end rather than ends in themselves. These are examples. Okay. And what Sri Ramakrishna says is through spiritual practice and by the grace of God, we should convert our worldly vision, our aihika chakshu, into divine vision, divya chakshu. So divya just means divine. So we need to change our vision to a divine vision, seeing the divine in everyone and in ourselves as well. So I was thinking in this context that in the gospel, many of you have read at least parts of the gospel, you'll know that one of the main things Sri Ramakrishna tells us to renounce is Kamini Kanchan, right? The 2 Ks, Kamini and Kanchan. Kanchan's easy, it means gold. So obviously, in general, it just means renunciation of unnecessary possessions, desire for wealth, right? Greed, those kinds of things. Kamini means literally, see, there are many words for woman in Indian languages and in Bengali as well. And Kamini literally means woman viewed as an object of desire. Woman viewed as an object of lust. And so again, I think it's a mistake to translate Kamini Kanchan as woman and gold. Not that it's wrong, but it's not sufficiently nuanced because there are many words for woman. And this has a very specific connotation, Kamini. Kamini means woman viewed as an object of desire or lust, which means viewing women with these aihika chakshu, with worldly eyes. And that's the same thing applies for women, viewing men or viewing whoever your object of desire is with worldly vision, with worldly eyes. Okay, so what needs to be renounced is ultimately, oh my goodness, this marker. What needs to be renounced is the aihika chakshu themselves. You have to get rid of this worldly way of seeing other human beings in this world, right? And to see everything aright as the divine. If you do that, you don't need to, you don't have to stop associating with, other people. You might have to at a certain stage in your spiritual practice, but ultimately, you should be able to, Swami, there's a beautiful letter. One of my favorite letters of Swami Vivekananda. I don't want to butcher it, but I'll just paraphrase briefly. He says to one of his, Mr. Leggett, he called him frankincense. He said, at the age of 20, I was the most uncompromising fanatic, and I wouldn't walk on the same side of the road as a prostitute, something like that. And he says now at age 33, and now he feels he's a very old man, 33. He left his body at 39, remembers. He led a short life. And he says now at 33, I can live in the same house with prostitutes, and I'm not in the least bothered, right? Have I become degenerate, or has my heart expanded? And he has there's this extraordinary passage talking about how he's actually expanded his heart through his spiritual practice. But as spiritual aspirants, we shouldn't jump the gun, and we should take certain precautions. And so these commentators, the traditional commentators, mention this again and again. They say, the genuine practice of brahmacharya, this is a quote from Daksha Samhita. The 8 kinds of sexual indulgences are thinking, talking, and joking about sex, looking at the opposite sex with passion. So again, this is kind of the worldly vision. Talking secretly about sex, determining to engage in it, attempting to do so, and actually performing the act. So only the last of the 8 is the actual physical act. The rest are more subtle forms of it. And if you indulge in the previous 7, inevitably you're going to end up engaging in the act. Okay? And so perfect brahmacharya means perfection at all those levels, which means essentially, just in one word, you have to get rid of this worldly way of seeing other human beings, basically, this aihika chakshu. And that might mean you have to avoid doing certain things, watching certain kinds of television, for instance, if there's like nudity in it or something like that. That's why I say it requires a change in lifestyle. You might have to change your friends, because some of your friends might be thinking along those wavelengths, and you're trying to, move away from that kind of thinking. So you may have to actually hang out less or not at all with certain people. You have to make new friends maybe who are more spiritually minded. So this is really not a very easy thing. It's a whole package deal, and it takes tremendous vigilance. And the mind can trick itself very easily too, and you can kind of say like, oh, well, he or she is a devotee, so I'm just helping them, and we're reading a spiritual text together. So there's so many ways that the mind and the ego plays tricks on us. And we have to be very, very careful, okay? And always remember, don't beat yourself up if you have a lapse or something, but the main thing is to confess to God and to your guru, and pick yourself up and try again. Okay. Bryant says at the end of this paragraph, in short, ultimate self-realization cannot be attained if one is sexually active, because this indicates that one is still seeking fulfillment on the sensual level, and thus misidentifying with the non-self. So this is what I said a little bit earlier, which is that it's only when we identify with the physical body that we try to gratify the physical body, right? So through spiritual practice, what we're trying to do is break our identification with the body-mind complex and to realize our divine nature. And so the more we do that, the less we're going to feel attracted to bodily kinds of desires and gratifications. That's the basic idea. Okay. And another thing, this is also important, and it's in relation to the next sutra, 2.31, which we'll discuss in a second. 2.31, in a nutshell, basically says these 5 yamas apply across the board, universally, to absolutely everyone, with absolutely no exceptions, regardless of who they are, what caste they belong to, what their line of work is, how old they are, everything. Okay, that's what the next sutra is about to tell us. We'll look at it in detail in a second. Okay, Bryant strongly emphasizes this, and I think it's important in the context of brahmacharya, for instance. Now, there are many householders who are spiritual aspirants, obviously, and they might be wondering, well, so that there must be a version of brahmacharya for householders, which means you're only sexually active with your own partner, for instance, and not with anyone else, and so isn't that good? Yes, it's good, but that's not perfect brahmacharya. Okay, and what you'll find in traditional Hindu wedding ceremonies even is that the bride and groom are reminded that the ultimate ideal is total brahmacharya, perfect brahmacharya, renunciation, and ultimately attaining liberation. And I've mentioned this several times, but I'll mention it again. there's a little a ritualistic component of the Hindu wedding, which is not always done. I don't know if in yours it was done or whatever, but it's called Kashi Yatra, which means pilgrimage to Kashi, pilgrimage to Varanasi. And ritualistically, the priest tells the soon-to-be groom, are you sure you want to go through with this? Or do you want to drop everything, leave your bride, and run off to Varanasi, become a monk and run off to Varanasi and try to realize the highest goal of life, which is liberation? Literally, it's a component. Now, do most people say, okay, and then leave the wedding ceremony? No. But what's the idea? The idea is to remind the newlyweds or the about to be newlyweds about the highest ideal in life. And that's why when householders came to Sri Ramakrishna and asked him for advice, he didn't water down his teachings. He didn't say, yeah, you guys can practice the householder version of brahmacharya. What he said was, after having one or two children, try to live with their spouse like brother and sister. So what does that mean? You don't have to follow it exactly literally, but the idea is marriage itself, your partnership itself is an evolving thing. It's a spiritual journey. And you ask any couple that's been with each other for like 50 or 60 years, they'll tell you how much their marriage has evolved. And they might talk about how on their honeymoon they were very passionately in love with each other, very romantic, and this and that. And then after 10 years, they have kids, and then the whole thing changes. And then their kids get old, and they get older, and then they change the way that they look at themselves and look at their partner. Yeah, do you have a question or a comment? Can you give the mic to Leela? Thank you.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about myself, and yes, my ex, but, we were married for some 12 years. And so, even the advancement of that, we were obviously very passionate in the beginning, but then we were thinking about kids, and then even beyond that, I could definitely see if I were to grow old with him, that there would be a point where you're looking for more of an emotional involvement that elevates the tenor of the relationships. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I think that's great, yeah. In Taittiriya Upanishad, 5 selves are distinguished, atmas, 5 atmas, okay? Or they often call them the 5 sheets, but I don't like that language. That's very classical Advaitic, and it makes it seem as if none of the sheets are real at the end of the day. But so Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya. So I want to mention the first 2. Annamaya Atma is the physical self. It's the physical body, right? And often a marriage will start with more of an emphasis on the physical, for instance, and obviously in combination with the second one, which is pranamaya, which is it's the emotional self or the vital self. Okay, and then I think one way of putting what you're suggesting is that as a marriage evolves, it moves away from the physical to more to the emotional, right? And then I also want to add, though. From my experience, not that much experience, but I've been a monk now for 15 years, and I've interacted with a number of devotees, householder devotees. I've seen the whole range of how householders deal with the grief of losing their partner. Okay, and I'm talking about, they're all devotees, like they may have been devotees for 50 years or 60 years, but some of them, after they lose their spouse, they're so devastated that they can't really, they kind of lose a purpose in their life. They become aimless. Sometimes they even kind of go off the deep end, and they become mentally unbalanced. They never really recover, and then they might even die shortly thereafter. Okay, and then there's another kind of devotee I've seen. This happened recently. I've heard for someone who lost their husband recently, and somewhat unexpectedly. I mean, the husband wasn't even that old, and she's been a devotee for a long time. And she said very simply, she said, Thakur has decided to take him away. And she handled it very maturely and with... So the marriage has to evolve away from the physical to the emotional, but it also needs to evolve away from the emotional even. Even that's a crutch, emotional attachments. Sri Ramakrishna used to contrast Maya and Daya. I talked about this 2 days ago in my gospel class, right? So Maya is selfish attachment, emotional attachment, strong emotional attachments to me and mine, right? I love my wife or my husband or my dog or my car or my house or my this, that, right? And we have to overcome that. And we have to replace that maya with daya, which is universal compassion, universal empathy for everyone by seeing the same divine in everyone. So that would be like the next stage in evolution, I would say, in any partnership. It doesn't have to be even just a romantic one or in marriage, but you have to ultimately overcome your emotional attachment to your mother and your father and your children, right? Everything. And to any possessions you might own, even to your own identity as a whatever you are, a doctor or a musician. So any kind of emotional attachment itself is a bondage from the highest spiritual standpoint. Okay, now, that was a lot on brahmacharya. Now, the fifth of the 5 yamas, the 5 don'ts, is, it's up here, aparigraha. Okay. Bryant translates this as renunciation of unnecessary possessions. And Swami Vivekananda, I think, more concretely, translates it as non-receiving of gifts, okay, in general, because it might create attachments and expectations. So let's read Bryant's commentary on this 5th yama. He says on page 247, Vyasa defines renunciation of possessions, so he should really say unnecessary possessions, as the ability to see the problems caused by the acquisition, preservation, and destruction of things, since these only provoke attachment and injury. There's trouble involved in acquiring things in the first place, says Hariharananda. Trouble, again, in trying to preserve and upkeep them. And trouble and distress when we inevitably lose them. So what's an example? I spent 20 years of my life raising money to buy that Porsche 911 that I've been dreaming about for so long. And then I buy it. And then you think, well, I must be happy. I am happy for some time. But then whenever I drive it around, and imagine I'm in LA as I am, now I'm paranoid about if somebody dents my car, or if a kid keys my car. And so even when I leave the car, I park it somewhere, my mind is still at the car worrying about its condition and whether it's okay. And so there's just a lot of anxiety, right? This goes back to another sutra. I think, did we talk about parinamatapa? I don't remember. I think we did. We did. Parinamatapa samskara. There are all these sources of why everything is sorrow. And one of the reasons is tapa. It's because even when we get something we desperately want, then there's this, we might lose it. This anxiety of losing the thing ends up preoccupying our minds. And anxiety as such is suffering. It's a source of suffering. It makes us feel uneasy. It makes us feel unhappy. And we're always worrying about losing that thing that we have, right? Okay. He continues. He says, hoarding wealth without sharing it is sheer selfishness and points to a complete lack of sympathy for the plight of others. Therefore, yogis attempt to give up all objects of enjoyment and take only what is required for their maintenance. Okay. Oh, and sorry, one more thing I wanted to mention in regard to brahmacharya. Remember last time I talked about how all the commentators say that the first of the 5 yamas is the most foundational. Ahimsa, non-violence or non-injury. Okay. Which means that all 5 of these yamas, if you don't practice that yama, you end up injuring other people in some form. So you might ask, how does that apply to brahmacharya? How do you injure another person if you don't practice brahmacharya properly? Well, the idea is, every time I look at another person with these worldly eyes, with worldly vision, I'm injuring that person. I'm not honoring that person's dignity, their spiritual dignity. And I'm degrading myself as well. I'm injuring myself in the sense of degrading myself by identifying with the physical body rather than with the deeper Atman within. Okay, so in that sense, non-injury understood in the sense of not honoring one's own dignity and the dignity of other people, the spiritual dignity of oneself and other people. That's how I see it. And so the same thing applies with gifts, because this world always involves trade-offs, right? So the more gifts I take, that means that other people are being deprived of the things that I'm getting, right? So in that sense, I'm injuring other people indirectly by receiving gifts. Okay, now, I would like to cover 2 more sutras, so let's try to do that. So 2.31, please repeat after me. This is page 248 of Bryant. Jati, Desha, kala, samaya, anavachinnaha, sarvabhauma, mahavratam. Okay, good. These yamas mentioned in 2.30, the previous sutra, those 5 yamas, are considered the great vow, mahavratam. They are not exempted by one's class, place, time, or circumstance. They are universal, sarva bhauma. Okay? Bryant has a really interesting commentary on this, which is, I want to read at least a large part of it because it's worth reflecting on. He says, in this very important sutra, Patanjali states that the yamas are absolute and universal for aspiring yogis. They cannot be transgressed or exempted under any circumstance, such as class, jati, place, desha, time, kala, or circumstance, samaya. They are non-negotiable for yogis. Patanjali is being conspicuously and uncharacteristically emphatic here. Why uncharacteristically? Because if you remember, those of you who are hardcore followers of this class, when we were talking about book 1, he's talking about different objects of meditation. And he goes through this long list. You can meditate on like a flame, this, that, God. And then there's a sutra which just says, meditate on anything you want. And it's totally, so it shows his liberality, right? And now here, he's suddenly being very, very strict and rigid. Okay? Deliberately so, but Bryant is emphasizing the fact that he's being uncharacteristically rigid in insisting that all 5 of these yamas are absolutely uncompromising. They have to be practiced by every aspiring yogi. That doesn't mean everybody. Most people aren't spiritual aspirants. And even among spiritual aspirants, not everybody follows the path of yoga. Okay? We're going to find in a second when we keep reading his commentary, you might wonder about the Bhagavad Gita, for instance. It gets very tricky. Because what is Krishna telling Arjuna to do? Kill a bunch of people. Now, the killing is not like, in a bad way in that sense. I mean, he's defending justice and he's fighting these evil people, which will result in even more death and sorrow to a lot of people. And so there's a serious question of, and Krishna keeps telling Arjuna, if you do this, this is your duty as a kshatriya, as a warrior. And if you do it and do everything as an offering to me, you will realize God, you will attain liberation. Okay? Now, that's a very different kind of stream of practice, basically, as we're going to see. So why don't let's read this. Okay, page 250. Bryant says, here we see a distinction between the requirements of yoga covered in, for example, the Karma Yoga section of the Gita, where Krishna exhorts Arjuna to do his civic duty as a kshatriya warrior and fight, to specifically engage in violent warfare, and the ascetic tradition represented by Patanjali. Ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C, right? We should remember when we're reading these kinds of texts, like Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and also I would add, for some people who are fond of classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta is meant for monastics. It's a strongly ascetic philosophy. So I would place Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta and Patanjali's Yoga Sutra in the same category in this sense. They are strongly and insistently ascetic spiritual philosophies. Okay, they're meant for monks, really. You can try to water it down and say it applies to everybody, and you can do that, but that's not really being true to the traditional texts and to Shankaracharya, if we're talking about Advaita. And it's equally not going to be true to Patanjali if we try to water down his teachings and kind of make these more flexible, okay, and negotiate on the 5 yamas, okay. Let me keep reading, though. This is the explanation of the Gita, because it's very interesting. He says, what may be acceptable or even required in a socio-civic context must be renounced in an ascetic yogic one. Okay. Indeed, it is with this ascetic alternative in mind that Arjuna initially precisely wishes to renounce violence and take up the ascetic life of mendicancy. This is a really interesting point. Some of you probably are familiar with the Gita. Remember back in chapter 2 of the Gita, verse 5, Arjuna is trying by hook or by crook to avoid fighting. And one of the things he says is, hey, isn't it better to become a monk? Because monks have to practice nonviolence. And so it's like a kind of, I can get out of this thing if I become a monk. That's what Sri Ramakrishna used to call monkey vairagya, which is like, because you don't want to face the reality of your life situation, you escape into monastic life. So it's a form of spiritual bypassing. We can call this monastic bypassing. So Arjuna was attempting this monastic bypassing route. But interestingly, what Bryant points out is, so even in the Gita, in the time of the Gita, when that was composed, there was this ascetic path where nonviolence has to be practiced absolutely across the board by everybody, if you decide to take that path, basically. And Arjuna knew that. Okay. So then Bryant says something important. He says, the Gita, of course, while accepting the Patanjalian type path as an acceptable means to attain liberation, and he mentions chapter 6. So people who are experts in the Gita will know. Chapter 6 is Dhyana Yoga, or Atma Sanyama Yoga, which is the yoga of meditation. And it's a bunch of verses talking about meditation, which is very much like Patanjali's philosophy and practice. Okay, and so it's there, it's honored, it's acknowledged. But the Gita, while accepting the Patanjalian type path as an acceptable means to attain liberation, has for the most part a different objective, one directed to socio-civic concerns, and thus construes a different means to attain perfection from within the parameters of the idealized social system, namely karma yoga, the path of action. Okay, so Bryant is rightly acknowledging that in the Bhagavad Gita, karma yoga is accepted as an equally valid path and actually a more advisable path for most people who are in the world, right? Many people are in the world. Karma yoga is far more practical, and it equally leads to liberation. It's not that karma yoga won't lead to liberation. It'll lead to some lesser ideal. It can lead to the highest goal. And he's acknowledging that here. So he's not saying that if you don't practice the 5 yamas strictly, you will not attain liberation, but you won't attain liberation through Patanjali's practice or through Patanjali's path. That's the idea. So then you have to explore a different path that's not meant for ascetics. Like the Bhagavad Gita, fortunately, that's one of the great texts of Hinduism. There's a reason why it's considered the Bible of Hinduism, because it's so broad, right? So now, I'm sorry that I skipped ahead a little bit, but now back to page 248, I want to read another important paragraph from the commentary, Bryant's commentary. He says, at the time of writing this section, so he wrote this book a few years ago, there is a discussion in certain quarters of the yoga community in America about the jurisdiction of the yamas in the 21st century West. He's getting a little catty here, I think. Whatever direction such discussions may take, and whatever hybrid practices evolve in the West under the rubric of yoga, this sutra makes it very clear that as far as Patanjali is concerned, there are no exceptions to these rules at any time, in any place, for anyone aspiring to be a yogi as defined by his system. One might imagine that in Patanjali's own circle, there would have been followers or disciples angling for exceptions to one or other of the yamas, perhaps arguing that the sacred Vedic law books, Dharma Shastras, themselves allowed the Brahmana caste, for example, to offer animals in Vedic sacrifices, or the Kshatriya caste to eat meat or engage in sexuality. He is therefore being as emphatic here as the straightforward and plain use of human language allows. Okay? So I think this is important. It's really important when we read spiritual texts, scriptures, that it's tempting, but we should avoid diluting the scriptures, dragging the ideal down to our level, and sort of trying to put words into in the mouths of these great sages and texts. I think we have to be careful not to do that. Recognize what the ideal is, and acknowledge where we are. And then say, all right, there's some room for improvement. I've got a few more phases in my journey to get to that ideal, but don't break down the ideal. That's the idea. I think that's what he's saying. Okay. And I think that's really, really important in general. It's very easy to, especially these days, because spirituality is kind of semi-trending. There are all these meditation apps, and it's all over the place now, right? So it's easier than ever to... You lead your life, your ordinary life, whatever worldly life you're leading, and then add a sprinkling of spirituality on top. And the Sanskrit terms here are yoga and bhoga. So it's very easy to justify bhoga, worldly enjoyment, in the name of yoga, spiritual practice, right? It's easier than ever to do that. But we should be careful about not doing that, in my opinion, and in Bryant's opinion, as far as I can tell. He gives another really interesting example. He says, this is bottom of page 249. He says, the commentators elaborate on this sutra through a discussion of nonviolence, since it is the most important yama. Remember, that's the first of the 5 yamas, ahimsa, nonviolence. And as first member of the list, represents the others. However, the following discussion applies to all the yamas. The yama of nonviolence, conditioned by caste jati, says Vyasa, can be seen in the case of, say, a fisherman, who, because of his caste occupation, inflicts violence only on fish, but nowhere else. That's his job. If he's a fisherman, he's got to kill fish. Now, how would Patanjali respond to that? Kshatriyas, the warrior class too, like Arjuna, are allowed to engage in violence in certain contexts. Think about the military, right? Hunting, for example, and of course, on the battlefield. While this may hold in other circumstances, such as these, non-violence has no conditions for Patanjali. So he's not exempting soldiers from violence. He's not exempting fishermen from violence to fish, for instance. This might seem kind of strange or too rigid, right? But let's keep reading. Jati literally means family of birth. Therefore, being born into a family or caste that eats meat does not constitute an exception to the practice of nonviolence. If, say, a kshatriya wishes to become a yogi, as understood by Patanjali, he must abandon violence, even if such violence is legitimate for persons of this caste, and indeed condoned or even required by dharmic prescriptions in the Dharma Shastra texts. Okay, and so on. So here's the thing here. He says, if, say, a kshatriya, so a warrior, wishes to become a yogi as understood by Patanjali, that's what's important. There are many ways of being a yogi, okay? And Patanjali's yoga is one way of being a yogi. But you can be a karma yogi. That's a different kind of yogi. And that's what's discussed in the next paragraph, which I talked about. In the Gita, that is one of the main practices recommended in the Gita. And in that case, if you're a soldier, you should do your duty. And if you do your duty well, and on a spiritual basis, which means you do your soldierly duty as an offering to the divine, you can attain the highest spiritual goal through that path. Okay. But Patanjali's, I actually like this commentary of Bryant's because he's actually, he's not doing this thing that it's one of the biggest vices in my opinion, in our tradition actually, and in other traditions as well. I call it lazy harmonizing. Lazy harmonizing. Lazy harmonizing means, why can't we all just get along? Jesus said the same thing that Ramanuja said, and Ramanuja said the same thing as Ramakrishna said, and Shankara said the same thing as Ramakrishna said, and everybody's saying the same thing. No, not everybody says the same thing. So what I like about this commentary of Bryant's is that he's saying that, look, let's grant uniqueness and distinctiveness to this text of Patanjali's and this particular path. There are some things it says which is going to conflict with other practices, even within Hinduism and other paths, okay? And I think that's very important to keep in mind. And then, so once you have a clear understanding of what these distinct traditions are and these different paths are, then you can choose the path that best suits you. But if you lump everything together, it's going to end up being, you're not going to be able to practice anything properly. This is my opinion. So let's be careful to avoid lazy harmonizing. That's my suggestion. So Patanjali does not say the same thing as Krishna in the Gita, for instance. Okay. And at the very end of the commentary, or close to the end, Bryant points out another thing that's important, which is that most of the commentators take this Sutra 2.31 to apply not only to the Yamas, but also to the Niyamas, which we're going to at least start talking about today. Okay? So they apply not only to the 5 don'ts, which are described in 2.30, but the 5 do's, which we are now going to segue into. Okay, so what are these 5 niyamas? Please repeat after me. Shaucha, Santosha, Tapaha, Svadhyaya, Ishvara, Pranidhanani, Niyamaha. Okay, good. Bryant translates this as the observances, so the things to do, the do's. The do's are, the niyamas are cleanliness. This sounds a little bit too, I don't know, it's like too much externally oriented maybe. So I think a word like purity might be better because it implies, we're going to find out in a second, it means both internal and external purity. Second term, santosha, and they're all here on the board. Here they are. Santosha means contentment. Okay. 3, tapaha. That means austerity, but we'll talk about what austerity really means. 4, Ishvara. Oh, sorry. Wait, did I skip one? What happened here? Cleanliness, contentment, austerity. Oh, yeah. Did I skip one? No. Shaucha. Okay, number 1, shaucha. Number 2, santosha. Number 3, tapaha, austerity. Number 4, swadhyaya, austerity. A study of scripture, sorry. So swadhyaya is study of scripture. That was my confusion, sorry. So number 4 is swadhyaya, and it means study, and specifically study of the scriptures. And the commentators also add mantra japa. Okay, and we'll talk about what that is. Some of you already know it, if you're initiated. And then the 5th of the 5 niyamas is Ishvara Pranidhana, which means devotion to God, bhakti. Okay? These 5 practices, these 5 do's, really are almost comprehensive. I mean, if you can practice these 5 things on a daily basis, it's amazing. You'll be a very good spiritual aspirant. So if you can observe the 5 yamas and observe the 5 niyamas, you'll make extraordinary spiritual progress without doing anything else. Okay, but attaining perfection in many of these is actually it's the work of many lifetimes. Okay, if you really understand how deeply these things go. So let's start reading the commentary. Bryant says on page 252, in contrast with the yamas, which are concerned with how the yogi interacts with others, the niyamas are centered on one's own personal discipline and practice. So I like this point. The idea is that the 5 yamas you talked about, the don'ts, are all of them you're going to find have to do with how you interact or engage with other people, other human beings. Every single one of them. Non-injury, brahmacharya, non-stealing, right? You steal from others, not from yourself, and so on. But the 5 niyamas, they have to do with your personal, individual spiritual practice. You could be alone on an island and still practice those 5 niyamas, every single one of them, right? The only one that has a relationship to another is Ishvara Pranidhana, which means devotion to God. But that's God, right? But it's not other beings on this earth, until you realize that all these other beings are God. But again, now the moment I say that, I'm lazy harmonizing, the thing that I was warning against. So we have to be careful. That's more vijnana and more of a bhakti path. Okay, so the first one's very easy to understand. As I said, shaucha I think is better translated as purity rather than cleanliness, and external cleanliness, external purity, means shower regularly and cut your toenails and that kind of stuff. Wear clean clothes and so on. One reason why, you might ask why. I think partly because if you are externally clean, it'll help you to achieve internal cleanliness. That's one of the main things, it seems to me. And the ultimate ideal is internal purity, okay? And Bryant explains this on the top of page 253. Internal cleanliness consists of purifying the mind of all contamination. The commentators speak of jealousy, pride, vanity, hatred, and attachment as examples of mental contamination. Okay, so the internal purity suddenly becomes quite difficult, right? External purity, yeah, if I shower every day and I, observe basic cleanliness rules, then I'll be externally clean. But being internally clean is much more difficult. Okay. Now, the second of the 5 niyamas is santosha. This is a very important one. Santosha means contentment. Be content with what you have. Don't always have this mindset of I want more, 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 more. A lot of people in this consumerist culture, especially we're sitting in the U.S., one of the most materialistic countries in the world, in that sense. Okay, so this is Bryant's explanation. He says, contentment, santosha, the second niyama, manifests as disinterest in accumulating more than one's immediate needs of life. As the Gita informs us, desire is the real enemy of the embodied soul, since it is never satisfied and burns like fire. Kama esha krodha esha rajoguna samudbhavaha mahashano mahapapma vidhyanam ehvairinam. That's the verse he's thinking of. And then he says, true happiness comes from contentment with whatever one has, not with thinking that one will be happy when one gets all that one desires. Even if there is some lack, says Shankara, one thinks it is enough. Or, as Hariharananda puts it, to avoid injury from thorns, one only has to wear one pair of shoes. One doesn't need to cover the entire earth with leather. This is a funny example. Okay, so this practice of contentment is extremely important, and it reminds me of a couple of my favorite scriptural verses. One of them is from the Vairagya Shatakam, the 100 verses on detachment by Bhartrihari, who used to be a king and then he becomes a monk, a all-renouncing monk. And he says, Satu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishala manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridraha, which means Satu bhavati daridro, that person is poor, daridra, yasya trishna vishala, whose desires are great. That person is poor whose desires are great. Manasi cha paritushte, when the mind is contented. Paritushta, notice this, almost the same term is used. This tushta. So santushta would be the adjective form of contentment. This is santosha. Santushta is contented or being content. And in the same way, manasi cha paritushte. Paritushta, paritosha. It's just the same word as santosha, but it's just, so it also means contentment. Manasi cha paritushte, when the mind is contented. Kortavan ko daridraha, who is rich and who is poor? And it's very practical, very relevant these days. There are some very visible multi-billionaires, trillionaire kind of people these days, Elon Musks and whatever. And you look at them and you wonder, but are they happy? Might be literally the richest person in the world, but are they happy? And if that person who's a billionaire or a trillionaire still has desires that are unfulfilled, that person is much less happy than the person who makes $5,000 a month, assuming some other country or something, and lives in a village and just barely makes ends meet, but doesn't have those kinds of desires, right? Is content with what they have. So a quote-unquote poor person who doesn't make that much money, but who is content with what they have, is actually far richer in this deeper sense, in this spiritual sense of wealth, is far wealthier than the trillionaire or the multi-billionaire who desires all sorts of things they don't have. I have 5 yachts, but now I want a rocket. I have a rocket, but now I want 6 rockets, and so on and so forth. There's no end to it. Why? Because as King Yayati says, and this is from a different scripture, Bhagavata Purana, na jatu kamaha kamanam upavogena shamiti havisha krishnavatmeva bhuya evavivate, which means desire is never satisfied through enjoyment. So if I have 1 yacht and I want 5 yachts, I get the 5 yachts, but what happens? Now I want the rocket. Because desire is insatiable. Mahashano mahapapma. Mahashano, this is the term used in the Gita, which means it's all-devouring, it's insatiable. Desire is never satisfied. And the more you feed it, the bigger it'll grow. The bigger its appetite becomes, and the more difficult it is to satisfy it. This is just the law of life. This is something that we realize through the school of hard knocks. And once we realize that, what happens? We scale back our desires. And this, now we come to my second, another one of my favorite verses. This comes from the Mahabharata, from the Shanti Parvan. The Shanti Parvan, by the way, of the Mahabharata is one of the most spiritually uplifting sections of the Mahabharata. It has these wonderful spiritual teachings. So this is one of them, one of these beautiful verses. For those nerds out there who want to look it up, this is 168. Look at you, I'm joking. 168.36. Okay, of the Shanti Parvan of the Mahabharata. Yaccha kama sukham loke, yaccha divyam mahat sukham, trishna akshaya sukhasyete narhata shorashim kalam. If you calculate all of the happiness one can get from sense objects, okay, kama sukham, as well as all the higher forms of happiness experienced in heaven, the divyam mahatsukam, so far greater, more blissful forms of enjoyment in these higher heavens. All this happiness is not even 1/16 of the bliss derived from eliminating one's desires. I think that's really beautifully put. There's tremendous bliss in reducing your desires, actually. You know, just imagine that you're addicted to something. Take your pick of whatever it is. You're a slave to that thing that you're addicted to. And then there's a struggle. When you after hitting rock bottom and you realize I've got this addiction, I need to overcome it. And you struggle, and it's hard. But once you achieve it, once you overcome that addiction, you get this feeling of liberation because you're freed from a certain kind of slavery. You were enslaved to that, whatever that object of addiction was. And now you're free from it. And there's tremendous joy in that. Just feeling the joy of being liberated from this thing that that had you in its grip for so long, right? So I think that's always important to keep in mind that in spiritual life is not about, we shouldn't think about it so negatively. It's like you have to just give up everything and avoid pleasure. It sounds like it's like a killjoy thing, but that's not the point. You're renouncing the lower for the higher. You're renouncing a lower form of happiness for a much greater spiritual form of joy, right? Okay. Well, I think we can actually stop here and open it to questions. So I've covered the first 2 of the 5 Niyamas. Shaucha, internal and external purity, and Santosha, contentment. And next time, in the next class, do I know when the next class is? Yes, I do. Oh, so heads up. Our next class is Tuesday, November 11th. So coming up soon, this next Tuesday. So please join us and we'll cover the remaining Niyamas. So do you have questions about anything we talked about today? Yes, can you give it to Ethan?
Thank you, Swami. In regards to the 5th Niyama, non-receiving of gifts.
The 5th Yama, yeah.
The 5th Yama, yes.
Yeah.
What if the gift is, let's say, a living thing, a pet, an animal? Because then someone might see this as being like, okay, it can be, a devotee to this pet. I can take care of this pet. It needs unconditional love, support. But there's also this lamentation or fear of loss. They might run away. They could eat something poisonous. And so is there... I don't know if you have just an opinion or perspective on maybe, if someone just brought me a cat and said, here you go, good luck, and ran away.
Right. No, that's great. Yeah. I've been tempted to give a talk called The Philosophy of Pets or something. I feel like I'm not qualified because I've never really owned a pet. I had a pet crayfish when I was in, I think, 2nd or 3rd grade, which escaped from its cage and then died. It was kind of sad. I think I also owned a guinea pig that I looked after for a few weeks as a kind of school assignment, and I don't think that went very well either. I don't remember. Anyway, so yeah, I'm not very good with. I haven't had pets, but this is a great question because I've thought about pets a lot. Especially you live in LA, and it's like. You feel like some people treat their pets better than they treat their own, their spouse and their kids. Even themselves, right? I mean, just the way they have those fancy shoes and then they feed them these amazing treats and then everything is like, and that's really high end. Now they even have like pet therapists, I think, for mental health issues for their pets. It really is no end to it. So yeah, what is the role of pets in spiritual life? This is quite interesting. I feel that pets are helpful in some ways, and then there are also dangers in having pets. And I think if you're a pet owner, just be aware of what those dangers are. So first of all, what are the helpful sides of it from a spiritual standpoint? I think it's very helpful, especially for children. Let's say for younger people, I think it's very helpful because it's this kind of thing where, because pets don't live usually as long as human beings do, right? A dog is dog years, right? So it's what, maximum what, 12 years, 13 years? I don't know. 12 to 15, 10 to 15, even 20, really? Okay. Okay, all right, so it depends on the size and the breed and whatever different kinds of things. But anyway, maximum 20 years, right? So I think it helps a lot of, especially young people, cope with mortality of a loved one. So they become very emotionally attached to that pet. They love the pet, and then the pet dies. And often they'll live through the whole thing. They'll see the dog as a puppy, and then they see him growing up. And then they also witness the dog's death, and they have to go through that mourning. It's a good kind of way to prepare for the death of a loved one, like a human being. So I think in that way it's very helpful. One of the dangers, I would say, is it's kind of like the even more modern danger of ChatGPT for people with mental health issues, for instance, because it's one of these things where, like with ChatGPT, a lot of people are now turning to ChatGPT for therapy, and I'm not even saying that you shouldn't do that necessarily. You have to be careful about it, but I think one of the reasons why they like it, why some people like it, is because it never talks back, or at least so far. It's almost, ChatGPT is almost errs in the opposite direction, which is it tends to be sycophantic. And so once ChatGPT figures out what you like and what you like to hear, it'll just give you a bunch more of that, So it's very affirming. But a real therapist, a really good therapist, is going to sometimes have to tell you things that you may not want to hear. And some people will fire the therapist the moment that happens. They're like, this is not a good therapist because he's being mean to me, or he's not being nice, right? But that's part of their job, it seems to me. So I think one now coming back, what's the danger of pet ownership? Well, and any pet owner out there might just pounce on me here for saying this, but hear me out. Pets don't talk back. Now they kind of do. I know people who they bark at you and they'll give you the silent treatment, sort of, but still. I think if you compare a pet to a human being, part of the reason why I think some people, when they become overly attached to a pet at the expense of human beings, there's some people like, that's why there's this trope, it's probably misogynistic, but the cat lady, right? But it doesn't have to be lady, but just somebody who is so obsessed with their pet that they're like misanthropes actually in day-to-day life. They hate other human beings, but they love their cat. The danger here is that you invest so much energy in that cat. And why? Well, because you resent other people because what? They have minds of their own. They might disagree with you. They might say you're wrong. They might fight with you. But with a dog, a cat, again, pet owners might say, yeah, they do the same thing, but I don't think it's at the same level, right? They'll love you unconditionally. They'll always come back to you. And there's some pet owners who are very mean to their pets, but the pets will keep coming back. The dog will still wag its tail and look for its treat, and you know what I mean? So I feel like the danger there, just be careful. I mean, if you have a pet, be careful about some of the dangers in pet ownership. Becoming overly emotionally attached, for instance, but also this thing. It was like, you might ask yourself, wait, why is it that I'm spending more time with my pet than with other human beings, for instance? And then you can kind of like figure out that there might be some imbalance somewhere in your life, for instance. And there's a danger of kind of like burdening the pet with playing this role as your emotional crutch in a way that may not be healthy either for yourself or for the pet. Okay? Okay, so that's a long answer too, but because it's been on my mind. But again, I don't think I'm the right person to give the talk because I've never owned a pet. Okay, anything else? Anything online? Are we good? All right, cool, good. Thank you, everyone. See you hopefully next Tuesday. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.